Okay, this is the cabin at Bucks Mills, a hamlet on the coast of North Devon. It was a summer painting cottage of the couple Judith Ackland and Mary Stella Edwards between the 1920s and Judith's death in 1971. The women were born in the 1890s, and their lifelong relationship began when they met as art students at the Regent Street Polytechnic around the time of the First World War. They enjoyed a certain amount of success as artists of topographical and still life subjects. Here's one of Judith Ackland's paintings, which obviously relates to the North Devon coast, although they travelled all over the country. And still life subjects. And their works found in various UK collections, as well as at the Burton Art Gallery and Museum in Bideford in Devon. I've loved this place, Bucks Mills, since I first came across it 10 or 15 years ago. And in Pride of Place, England's LGBTQ heritage project that I led as a consultancy for Historic England between 2015 and 16, we succeeded in getting the building newly listed at Grade 2. So, Historic England is the government agency for the historic environment, and it's very roughly equivalent to the USA's National Park Service. It does not itself own or manage historic sites. It's separated from English Heritage in 2015. It has statutory powers to recommend buildings, gardens, and other sites for national listing, signalling their heritage value. Valuing the historic environment. In recent years, Historic England has increasingly recognised that minority communities and identities need a stronger voice and better representation of their place and pasts within the national heritage canon. So in this paper, I'm going to discuss particular examples of artists' homes and places from our Pride of Place work, and I have to define this fairly widely rather than specifically, artists' studio homes. As you'll see. And through this discussion of 3 or 4 places, I'll address some of the issues around queer heritage, particularly how to open up the mechanisms for interpreting the queer past at various places. I mean, Andrew's paper really resonated. As queer visitors, we have to create our own interps. It's not necessarily there for us, although hopefully that is now changing. Okay, I'll probably leave you to read the Pride of Place outputs, what the whole range of stuff we did for the project, which is in the list in the conference papers. Perhaps the three first were quite important, or the most important. The interactive crowdsourced map, which covered all sorts of contemporary places as well as historic places. The listings, which is what I'm going to talk about today, and the online exhibition, which is still up there. The crowdsourced map is still live as well, so you can add to it. And various other activities. Okay, so definitions and terminology. What counts as queer? In Pride of Place, we aim to work with a very broad definition of queer heritage. We included homes and public places where people acted on their same-sex love and desire, where they crossed gender boundaries to pass as the opposite sex, where people organised politically to overturn homophobic laws, and of course sites of commemoration. Today's identity labels, such as lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, only became current in the 1950s and 60s. We use the term queer a lot for various reasons, but one of the reasons was its usefulness as an umbrella term, chronologically and across various identities and activities. And to avoid anachronism, we try to use language, this is in the online exhibition, for example, we try to use language from the relevant period, or that people use themselves, or very general descriptors. So, in discussing Edwards and Ackland, for example, we describe them as lifelong partners. Where are they again? Mary Stella Edwards was also a gifted poet published by the Hogarth Press, and her poems of mourning after Judith Ackland died speak powerfully of her grief and of their love. And this kind of very broad-based language was certainly used by Historic England as they turned our recommendations into listings. And this is a screenshot of the listing of the cabin on the National Heritage List for England, the Nelly. Now, listing a building is often seen as a sort of gold standard of heritage recognition, but a new listing is very difficult to achieve. A place has to be judged as having special architectural or historic interest, and this isn't very flexible. Indeed, aesthetic or architectural merit trumps social history significance every time. You have to have the former, the latter is optional. The cabin, I mean, you probably can't read this very well, I'm afraid, but the cabin was an example of a relatively unmodified vernacular building, in this case, a fisherman's store dating from the mid-19th century. And if a house has been structurally altered to any degree, which most buildings still standing have been, but that really generally disqualifies the possibility of their being listed. Okay, so you can see the reasons for listing here, that it was a well-preserved and little altered former fisherman's store, and then its social history interest, its association with Ackland and Edwards artists, and devoted lifelong companions. In contrast, although we put forward Prospect Cottage, filmmaker Derek Jarman's home and garden at Dungeness in Kent for listing, this did not succeed, despite it being being an iconic queer artist's home. And this, broadly speaking, was because the building was relatively recent. It had been altered quite a lot. It had an impact on its, quote, modest character, and the garden was also thought to be very ephemeral in its nature. So there's an interesting tension here. Tangible aesthetic value, measured in very traditional ways, remains key to the statutory recognition of places in England. At any rate, it's different in other countries, and overrides the social history value, the intangible heritage of many sites associated with queer people and their histories, including of artists. In terms of official processes, we have more success with amending the official descriptions of places that were already listed to add further material on their significance for queer history. We were alerted to this place, St Anne's Court, Chertsey, via the crowdsourced mapping aspect of the project. St Anne's Court, on the edge of southwest London, is an avant-garde circular modernist house in reinforced concrete built in 1936 to 1937 to the designs of Raymond McGrath. It was commissioned by a couple, Gerald Schlesinger, a successful stockbroker, this is the stockbroker belt then and now, and Christopher Tunnard, a major landscape architect. The two men lived at St Anne's for most of the year. And what's significant about this building, apart from its beauty, is the way that they had the interior designed. The first floor master bedroom was designed to enable their double bed to be separated easily into two and rolled back into the wings of the bow tie-shaped room. So in this position, the one bedroom became two single bedrooms separated by movable screens and a circular dressing room. And so with this arrangement, they could maintain the fiction when they had house guests, that they slept in separate rooms, of course, essential when sex between men was illegal. So here it's the queer architecture and design that's significant, and we were able to get the listing description amended to include this aspect as having LGBTQ importance. Another listing amendment was to Priest House. This is another of my favourites, although I've only got time to say something very brief about it. Priest House is in the grounds of Small Hythe Place in Kent. This was the home of theatre director and suffragist Edie Craig and her two women lovers, artist Claire Atwood, Tony Atwood as she was known, and writer Christopher St. John. Her given name was Christabel Marshall. So a lesbian ménage à trois, Edie and the boys, as they called themselves. And here are, that's the cottage in the beginning of the 20th century. Here are a couple of Atwood's paintings. This is one showing the terrace of Priest's house with Edie and I think Chris inside and a house guest, and another of Edie Craig in bed. But by mentioning Small Hythe, I want to sort of also highlight how queer heritage gets represented at sites or not. I mean, Small Hythe is an example of where queer heritage has been increasingly discussed in the interpretation since the mid-2000s, dating from when a new house steward was appointed. It's a National Trust property. Before that, there was no whisper of queerness. The primary focus of the site overall is as the house and museum of Ellen Terry, the famous Victorian actress and Edie Craig's mother. So Small Hythe demonstrates the importance of local as well as national managers who actively identify LGBTQ histories to visitors and, activate them. Now, let's move to Henley Bridge in Berkshire. Anne Damer had a successful late 18th century career as a sculptor. Here she is. And among her other work was commissioned to make the keystone sculptures of Isis and Nemesis on Henley Bridge in the late 18th century. Damer had separated from her husband John Damer, moved in blue-stocking circles, and was heavily rumoured to have affairs with women. One 18th century diarist described her as being, quote, a lady much suspected of liking her own sex in a criminal way. Women who loved women were often prey to gossip in 18th century London. In 1794, another satirical pamphlet repeated this accusation, this time publicly. Damer ignored all these attacks, but they did affect the way that she and her long-term partner, Mary Berry, who lived at Strawberry Hill nearby, organised their 40-year-long relationship. And this is a sort of awkward way of segueing into Strawberry Hill, if I have time. Anne Damer was close to her cousin, Horace Walpole, who built, or perhaps we should say massively renovated, Strawberry Hill House as a Gothic fantasy. And on his death in 1787, she inherited the house. Historical accuracy is also a powerful argument for queering places, their former inhabitants, and their various forms of art. In our Pride of Place online exhibition, we've got a couple of places discussing amongst others Strawberry Hill as part of a tradition of queer architecture, that there's a thread of queer sensibility that links many places. And indeed, there's quite an academic literature on the thread of the reworking of the neo-Gothic from the late 18th to the early 19th century in particular. Probably nobody here needs reminding of the story of Strawberry Hill and how Walpole designed it with a group of his male friends and his exaggerated use of the neo-Gothic style and its playful campness. His collections, the trompe-l'oeil wallpaper to create the monastic glooph, and on the other hand, the effusion of the mirrored crimson and gold gallery. But we had some pushback about including Strawberry Hill in our exhibition on the grounds that we were portraying Walpole as homosexual, which of course is not what we were saying. Indeed, Walpole is, I'm not a Walpole scholar, but he's not especially known to have had any sexual relationships with men or women. But in February of this year, the National Trust, which advises Strawberry Hill, which is, has its own, it's a sort of a trust in itself with St Mary's University. But the National Trust hosted a conference of North American and UK scholars of queer Walpole this February. which has convinced the more conservative amongst the Strawberry people to begin to organise queer tours and interpretation. So, bringing scholarship to light and encouraging change. Okay, so I'll sum up some of these ways in which it has become, in which LGBTQ interpretation has become easier to achieve, and some of the ways in which we can hopefully move this on further. Official top-down recognition is important. I mean, Historic England's Pride of Place project helped legitimise the queering of heritage by other bodies, those that actually manage sites and properties. I mean, the National Trust is a good example. In 2017, to commemorate the 50-year anniversary of partial decriminalisation of sex between men, they ran a Prejudice and Pride theme, which involved at least a dozen of their properties. In the UK, heritage bodies have a legal, well, depending on whether they're a public body, have a legal obligation through the 2010 Equality Act. Not that anyone's going to run around trying to enforce that, but it does sort of help shift the context. I've mentioned the significance of individual heritage managers at different levels of organisations. Commercialisation as well. Far from offending visitors, which was perhaps the fear 10 or 15 years ago, queer heritage can be a selling plot point, and the National Trust's audience research showed that, on balance, they had a very positive reception to their Prejudice and Pride theme. And I've also cited the argument for historical accuracy. And just to sort of finish on that, I think the issue here is often, and this is what happens, I think, at the sites where queer heritage is best interpreted. I'm thinking also the Ladies of Llangollen's house at Plasnewydd, is raising the issues of queer history, raising them as questions, using the evidence from the period in which those people lived, for example, without necessarily sort of trying to bolt it down into fixed facts. And I think that's the way to go in heritage interpretation of the queer past, where evidence interpretation is exciting because it's so fluid, but is not a question that produces fixed answers. Thanks very much.